Hey there friends, do you feel like we're doing way more work than people who actually get paid to do work to figure out what the heck happened with the Trump assassination attempt? I do. First guys, I want to tell you about my friends over at CMMG. They make some of the finest rifles on the planet. These guys make rifles in tons of different calibers, different Cerakotes, some of the most reliable firearms I've ever had. I've been a fan of theirs for many, many years. If you go to their website, you can use a code that I've heard about, FTATF, and you will get 10% off whatever you purchase. So if you check out my friends CMMG, you will save some money. Okay guys, one of the biggest mysteries that I still don't feel like we have a solid answer on was how many pieces of brass were on the roof. If Crooks, according to FBI Director Wray, fired 8 shots, that's what he claims, and that's what he claims they found on top of the roof. If Crooks fired all 8 of those rounds, then we should be able to find those, right? They should be up there. We're on a 1-on-12 roof, so they're not going to roll off. They're simply not going to. We're talking about bottleneck brass. They're not going to roll off on this type of roof because you've got about a 20-inch little gap in between each one of the little rails that come up on the roof. So we know the rounds aren't rolling off. So everything should be contained on top of the roof. Well, the video they put out did not effectively answer a lot of questions, and if they did anything with that video, it was to create more potential conspiracy and question marks. The first part of the video shows the guy on the scene, the SWAT guy, if you want to call him that, count out confidently 5 rounds.
Watch out for shell cases.
2, 3, 4, 5 right there.
Then several minutes later, 20 or so minutes later, as the video rolls, but more than that actually, because about 11 or 12 minutes was cut out of the middle of the video. Then when somebody else comes up there, now they count the 5, and then they count 3 additional ones, and those 3 additional ones, according to this SWAT guy, appear to be on the opposite side of the ridge, on the south side of the ridge facing Trump. So the 5 were on the north side where Crooks's body was, and 3 more, according to this guy, are on the south side. Now it certainly didn't help their cause any by having that split in the middle taken out. A doctored video is a doctored video. When you leave something out, people assume you left something out for a reason. Certainly wasn't for time reasons, because you had about 20 minutes rolling on that video where nothing was discussed. So it couldn't possibly be that you were just saving something. It was chopped up. So the extra 10 minutes would not make that much of a difference. So in order to determine for the average everyday person and the average gun owner too, somebody that does shoot on a regular basis, you may not pay attention to where your brass flies whenever you're shooting an AR-15. There are a lot of consistencies and a lot of similarities when shooting an AR-15, but just like anything else, the slightest little deviation in the build of that AR-15, the type of ammo, the buffer weight, there are so many things that come into play with where that brass is going to wind up. What I wanted to do is get as close as I can to that on my own, and I like doing stuff like this instead of the math and the geometry and the trigonometry. This is some caveman stuff, and I enjoy this type of research even more. So what I did, I took a bone stock Palmetto State Armory AR-15. The reason why I wanted to do this is because this thing does not have an adjustable gas block, and it's very unlikely with the DPMS model that Crooks had. It likely did not have an adjustable gas block, and that means something, and we'll get into that later. But that adjustable gas block is more of an upgrade. So with that DPS model being more of an entry-level model, it's unlikely that it had an adjustable gas block. Quick side note, point of irony here. I'm using a Palmetto State rifle who actually bought DPMS, and now they make DPMSs themselves. So probably a better product now than what it was back then. But I am using a bone stock Palmetto State. This thing right here has 0 modifications on it. This is straight out of the box. Now, because the FBI and the Secret Service are not giving us much information, I figured I would shoot .223 ammo and I would shoot .556 ammo. I'm doing this because I have heard the gun described both ways before, so I wanted to make sure that I did at least shoot both rounds. Now, to somewhat simulate the roof pitch, I decided to go ahead and put a table up on a stool to give it a little bit of an angle to get as close as I could to what we were dealing with. Now granted, the surface that the brass is going to fall onto is still level, not sloped like that, so there's going to be some disparities, but I'm not climbing on a roof in order to conduct this experiment. First thing I did was load up my 223 ammunition. 8 rounds into my Mission First Tactical magazine, and then onto my simulated roof to run off these shots. And I tried to do it in a similar cadence with the 3 slower paced and then the 5 fast paced. So what I did is I figured that where my ejection port was probably about 12 inches from the edge of the table. So I measured out from that to get where all of my rounds fell. And as you can see, they fell pretty far apart from one another. This is a pretty wide angle that these rounds were coming. So I did this several times with the 223 and then got an average and left the farthest ones out. Then I took an actual round of the 223 and I put it where the spent brass was. I wanted to be able to identify what rounds went where, because now I'm going to shoot the 5.56, so I wanted to keep something out there, and to not confuse the spent brass, I went ahead and put actual rounds out there. So I loaded up my 5.56 into my Mission First Tactical magazine, and here we go. Same cadence, slower 3, then faster 5. Really close, not a whole lot of disparities. If you notice these rounds, again, the full rounds were my 223 rounds, and the empty casings that you see here are from the 5.56. So really they fell within the same area. I did this exercise several times, and then I went ahead and did the same thing and put my 5.56 where the spent casings were, so you could see the differences between the types of ammo, the 223 and the 5.56. Now the closest to the ejection port that I found was 7 feet. So I made sure that I kept that number 7 feet, knowing that that's the closest that one of these spent brass would fall. So I wanted to be able to get somewhat of a grid to determine where my pattern would lay next to where Crooks' body was on the roof. So in order to plot that out, I figured in front of my ejection port, going in front of me, it was 5 feet out where the closest casing went, and it was 2 feet behind me, behind the ejection port, where the farthest one behind me actually flew. Now, one thing that I wanted to mention real quick is that I took another firearm out there that shot 5.56. I took my custom Wyndham Weaponry Legally Armed America rifle out there. This is an older rifle with an old aim point optic on top of it. The purpose of this was to shoot one of the rounds, and I shot a couple of them, but one of them that you'll see here, I shot one round to show you what the difference in the brass is. And the reason why is because if for some reason the FBI and the Secret Service now, because they've picked all these brass rounds up and washed the roof off, if they now say, oh, we're pretty sure they were all shot from the same gun, I mean, of course they would. Take our word for it, right? There is somewhat of a fingerprint that you get whenever you shoot from a particular gun. There's everything from the ejector, even where it impacts the deflector. There are things in there that are going to make a difference on that brass, so you can put 2 pieces of brass next to each other and you will be able to see a difference between rifles that are being fired. So if I want to show the pattern of where those spent brass casings went, let's take a look at where Crooks was. So I have this shot of him on top of the AGR building. In order to get my Google Maps shot from above to line up with where this picture is, I determined that based on where they show Crooks' body, you can see there's a downspout right near there, and one of the little runs over, and I'm calling those little strips in between on the roof, one over from that downspout is where Crooks' body is. So that's why I made these blue marks here, so you can see what I'm looking at in order to determine where this is on Google Maps. So I have my overhead map from Google Maps, and what I did was I wanted to get my dimensions of the roof so that I can use my new dimensions from where the spent brass went to determine not only where Crooks was, but where the brass actually went in relation to him. So I have the dimensions of the roof signified here. Now I'm able to place Crooks on here based on those measurements. Now we're assuming that he was about 6 foot tall. You see I have 71 inches there, so I have him at 5'11" right here. That's where it looks like his body was. It definitely mathematically is where he was, but again, I'm just assuming that that was his height. So if I take the measurements that I pulled from the range when I went and shot the brass, 84 inches away from me, that's 7 feet, right? Remember we said the closest brass fell 7 feet from the ejection port. That's 84 inches. So I measured out 84 inches using Google Maps. Then the widest span from left to right was 88 inches inside that area that the brass fell. So I measured out my 88 inches. Once I was done, this is what it looked like. I have crooks there in blue. 7 feet to the right is where the area is that the brass falls. If you look at the yellow line is the ejection port going right. That's essentially going straight 3 o'clock is where that yellow line goes. So I'm showing you essentially where the ejection port was. It's in front of Crooks's head. If Crooks is in the prone position, the ejection port is about 8 to 12 inches in front of his head, depending on how he's holding the rifle. So the red square, that's the area that brass should have fallen based on my experiment. You see, I've got 8 foot 3 inches and 7 foot 3 inches going forward. Now these are obviously the terms that were inches. We did have 88 inches and 100 inches, and again, that's what they convert to in feet. Now where I have the yellow line, remember there was 5 feet in front of me, in front of the ejection port whenever I went and shot, and 2 feet behind me that the rounds went. That yellow line is separating that. So below the yellow line is going to be 2 feet of distance, and in front of it is 5 feet of distance. Can I point something out real quick to you? Notice that according to my numbers and my measurements, that series of dots that you see going left to right, those are older vents and turbines that were on top of this roof. This roof was redone since this Google Map picture was taken. In other words, since these pictures were taken a year or so ago, AGR has redone this roof. That's why the roof looks different on a lot of the pictures that you've seen with Crooks on it. So where you see those dots going across, that is the peak of the roof. So it's sloping up to where those dots are going across, and then it slopes back down going towards Trump on the other side of those dots. Note my square. If that's where the brass fell using my rifles, unless Crooks's rifle was overgassed, and we'll get into that in just a second, then his brass should not have gone past that peak onto the south side of that roof. So the 3 that they came back later and described on the south side of that roof should not have been there unless there was an issue with Crooks's gun, but it did not have, in my opinion, a gas block on it that could be adjusted. So it's unlikely it was overgassed, because usually those stock gas blocks are not going to be overgassed. Just to give you a general idea of how brass should fall, I found this graphic from Springco online. If you notice, most of the brass fell where it should have. You see in the green healthy gas pattern. It looks like this Palmetto State might be slightly healthy, but a little unhealthy because it's slightly overgassed, because it was sending the brass more forward from 3 o'clock. It should have been straight out to the side or a little bit back. And as you noticed, more of them went forward into that 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock area. But nothing went 1 o'clock to, or at least nothing went to the 1 o'clock area that far forward. Now, according to everything I've done as far as this Palmetto State, and even the Wind and Weaponry rifle that I shot as well, none of these spent casings should have been where they picked the 3 up on the other side of the roof. Again, this is pretty basic, rudimentary stuff that I'm doing right here. We did not need to certify Guinness and everybody else to come in order to do this. This is basic stuff, right? Anybody shooting an AR-15 is pretty familiar with the trajectory of these spent casings and all that. So am I saying that somebody planted those 3 rounds on the other side of that peak? I'm not saying that. I mean, I'm not saying they didn't. I'm saying that it's possible for those rounds to have made it up there if there was an issue with the firearm. If it was overgassed, that's the only way those rounds should fly forward, at least that far forward, because it's hitting that deflector. And boy, if it's hitting that deflector hard enough with enough oomph on it to send those rounds off that deflector and that far forward, we have a gas issue on that particular firearm. And again, most of those entry-level firearms do not come with an adjustable gas block. That means the gas at the front, you can adjust it to give you more or less gas. That's usually where people screw up, because they overgas it. These don't have those entry-level rifles don't. So it's unlikely that it was over-gassed from the factory with the non-adjustable gas block on it. Now, if I'm not believing these guys that those 3 rounds actually came there from Crooks's gun, are we ever going to find out? Well, of course not. It's not like they're going to ever tell us what they did or what they didn't do, right? We know that. But there is another way to find out if those pieces of brass came from Crooks's gun or somebody else's, especially since we know they have Crooks's firearm, right? If they kept the brass, which you know they did, and hopefully they separated it, which maybe they didn't, but we could determine the differences between that brass if it in fact came from a different firearm. Looking at these 2 pieces of brass that I picked up off the ground, the one on the left is shot from the Palmetto State Armory AR-15, and the one on the right is from the Wyndham Weaponry AR-15. At first glance, it doesn't seem like there's much different, but I want to show you a little bit here that are definite, if you want to call them fingerprints, as to what you'd look for. First of all, look at the primer strike. The primer strike on the left, the PSA, it's a shallower dimple. Notice where the dimple in the center is. Immediately right outside that area, you can see more of the brass of the primer. Look to the Wyndham Weaponry one on the right. That dimple is pretty distinct, and it's much deeper than the dimple on the left. So there's a lot less material around that immediate circle on that primer. So that's a distinct difference. You definitely have the firing pin of the Wyndham Weaponry that's hitting harder than the firing pin on the PSA. So the primer strike alone shows me a difference that would certainly tell me a story. But you're going to see here in a second a lot of other characteristics that are going to be on that brass that's going to tell us again the type of rifle that it came from, and you would be able to duplicate this using those same rifles. So I've got those same 2 pieces of brass here. I'm going to keep the Wyndham on the right and the PSA on the left. Start to notice some of the different markings. Everything from the side, you're going to see a dent on the side, a distinct dent. And then you're going to start to see things besides just that primer, scuff marks on the back side of that round. Now what I did here is I wanted to show you what an unfired round would look like. The one in the middle obviously has not been fired. Notice how clean, even around the rim and everything, how clean that thing is. So all those marks came from firing this particular round. Now the first thing I want you to look at is the extractor. The extractor is essentially a hook that grabs the lip or the rim of the round and grabs it and pulls it backwards. And the ejector is a spring-loaded device that's putting pressure on the back of that round so that when it gets to the ejection port and gets free, it immediately gets kicked out. So to give you a general idea, this right here is your extractor and this is your ejector. This ejector has a spring behind it and it pushes up on the round. So that extractor up at the top, that's kind of a claw. That grabs that rim of that brass, and you'll see what it does to it here in a second. So note the face of these. You're going to see scuff marks all along there, and you even see a little bit of brass that's kind of torn up here on the back side of this rim. That's the Wyndham round. You don't see that on the PSA one. Now looking at the sides here, this is where that deflector is hitting. Notice on the PSA one, the deflector is slightly hitting the side of the brass, where the Wyndham one is hitting it pretty hard, giving it a much bigger, almost twice the size dent on the side of that casing. This is where that dent comes from. When that brass is coming backwards like this, it hits that deflector. And that little rim that you see down there is what's giving us that mark on the side of that brass. This will give you a better idea of it. Notice how whenever it's going backwards like this, eventually the bolt slams to the back and it kicks that brass out, and that's where it's giving us that mark right there on the side of that brass. But notice we talked about the claw on the extractor. Look at the distinct marks on each one of these pieces of brass. They're actually noticeable. If you notice that the extractor is a much cleaner mark on the one on the right, which is the Wyndham round versus the PSA round. So these are things that are very easy to point out. All brass is going to look very similar being fired from the same gun. Okay friends, to be clear, you know we'll likely never get any real answers on all this, right? First of all, the inventory of the brass, it's all going to be thrown into one bag or one Ziploc or whatever. So it's probably not separated. They're not going to let us look at it. This is an ongoing investigation, right? if you wanted to know if that brass came from two different guns, you could easily conduct a study on that and determine that. You could very easily do that, especially if you had the firearm from Crooks. Obviously, they're stating there was not a second firearm that fired any of that brass, so we're not going to have one of those to experiment with. But if they let us have Crooks's firearm and they let us have all 8 pieces of brass, we could determine if those 8 pieces of brass came from that gun using what I did here between the logistics of where the brass fell once it was fired and looking at the, quote, fingerprint of the brass once it has been fired from that particular AR-15. Now, to be clear, is every piece of brass going to go in the same direction? Of course not. Just for all of the guys out there that are going to say, oh, yeah, I'm making it very clear here. I said it before and I'll say it again. Brass is going to go where brass goes based on so many things. It might even be as something as simple as the humidity outside has an effect on that. But certainly the buffer weight does. Certainly the spring in the buffer makes a difference. The weight of your bolt carrier group, right? The gas, maybe you've shot your gun a lot and your gas tube is getting clogged up, getting, funked up in there. If you've adjusted your gas block, because if you do have one on there, you can increase or decrease the amount of gas that goes through there. There's so many things. Bullet weight, grain weight, you're going to have the amount of gunpowder in there. So there are a lot of variables out there. But if you're using the same gun to conduct this test, we could figure it out. If they would loan us Crooks's gun for a weekend, I could give you all the answers you wanted on that in a very unscientific study. We'd look like cavemen out there, but we could actually provide answers. Here we are going on 2 weeks, and nobody has given us any answers. I'd be willing to bet nobody has done any testing on this rifle. Nobody has looked through the evidence. They have made this an open and shut case. They are not investigating this. Now, granted, they're going to have some study done on this or something. I think somebody's commissioned, maybe Joe Biden commissioned something. Do you really think anything's going to happen? I mean, do you honestly believe that? And even though what I've shown you here today is super simple, do you even think they're going to do that? No. Because when you go into it saying that we don't have anybody else firing these weapons, and we know without a doubt that all 8 rounds came from this same AR-15, then in their mind, they have nothing to investigate. But until they actually show me video of Crooks firing that weapon and all pieces of spent brass flying from that ejection port and landing on that roof, I will not believe it until they show me. Somebody somewhere has video. Somebody somewhere has more than this. Now, granted, I want to thank some people out there right now that are doing excellent work on this. First of all, Mr. Guns and Gear. Mike does incredible work. He's very smart. He's done a lot of this type of precision shooting. He understands a lot of that stuff. I encourage you to go check him out if you can. Chris Mortensen and Mike Adams have done some awesome audio work. I don't know those two guys, but I mean, I do want to give a hat tip to them because they've been very helpful in some of the stuff that I've looked at. So those are 3 resources that I have certainly relied on: Chris Mortensen, Mike Adams, and Mr. Guns and Gear. So you definitely want to check those guys out if you want to see more information. Speaking of Mr. Guns and Gear, I think he put out today on, I believe it's his Instagram account, some groundbreaking information. We've been going back and forth talking about the audio signatures of a lot of these guns and these firings of these rifles and whatnot. And I think there's been some inconsistencies based on where cameras are, based on the proximity. Is it a fixed camera? Is it somebody moving around with their iPhone camera? There's a gentleman that he posted, that Mike from Mr. Guns and Gear posted today, that is actually between the AGR building and the group of people where Trump was, like right in the middle of them. And he is filming, aiming at, first of all, he aims his gun at the water tower. I mean, excuse me, his camera at the water tower. Then he turns it towards the AGR building. So this is before guns were fired, right? This is before that. So I think that's where the crowd was saying, hey, guys got a gun, and there's law enforcement running over there. Then the shots ring out. Let me tell you something. When the shots ring out, you've got to look at this video and listen to it. Because now, this guy's in the middle of where everything took place. It sounds remarkably different now coming from that. Remember, the vantage point that we had before it came from the west side where the group of people were on the side of the AGR building, and the microphone, the other one, in front of Trump. Now we've got one split right down the middle, and it's way different. So I'm very excited to see how these guys analyze the audio on this one. Now this will be a moving camera, so we can expect to hear some differences, but there's also some consistency in the sound of those shots as well. So I encourage you to check that out. I'll likely put that video out there tomorrow or Tuesday or something like that. So I'll try to provide that for you guys too, and I'll give you my opinion on that as well. But it's out there, just letting you know that it's already out there. So thank you guys for watching the video. I hope this, if nothing else, answers some questions. I hope it's generating some thought. Like I've said in a lot of my videos, my purpose, I would love for somebody else to be doing this work. I'm talking about the federal government or whomever. I would love for there to be an independent counsel or independent group that properly investigates everything that you see everybody working on out there, but they're not. So we're doing that. And what I'm trying to do is generate some thought that might bring up people like you out there who are way smarter than me that might go, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right, or that doesn't seem right. There are some very smart professional people out there that have way better ideas and way better investigative skills than I do that are sending me some really good information, whether it's through the comments in the video below, which I encourage you to do, or sending me an email at paul@legallyarmedamerica.com. Very good info out there, and I'm hoping that that's what this is doing, is generating that independent thought where we can have this conversation, since the people who are supposed to be investigating this are either not doing it or they're doing a really crappy job. Again, guys, thank you so much for watching my videos. It means a lot to me that you spend your time watching my videos. Please like, subscribe, share the videos. Sharing the videos is a big help. Obviously, subscribing is too. Make sure you're still subscribed. By the way, YouTube has a really bad habit of unsubscribing you. But if you share the video, it gets out there. It's able to beat the algorithm crush that YouTube is putting on these videos. They don't like these videos being out there. They don't like us talking about firearms especially, but they don't like us questioning the narrative of what the media and everybody else is either covering up or not answering. So they're squashing these videos. So when you share them, that lets them bust out of that bubble and get into the algorithm and get into the stream of videos that are being recommended and push them out there. So when you share these and recommend these with friends and family, that certainly helps get them outside of that bubble and reach more people. So thank you for doing that, guys.
God save the Queen, man.
I'm sorry, I thought this was America.
He's over.